So this episode is titled What the F is Political Polarization?
Increasingly, people are actively disliking the people with different points of view, and that makes it much worse.
You're about to go sit across the dinner table with your uncle who doesn't have the same opinion as you.
Got myself in trouble in the past for saying, I don't think education is about being comfortable. I think it's about being uncomfortable.
How do we go out into the world and know what to believe? Where does free speech end and then speech that might actively recruit people into extremism begin?
Cancel culture was rife.
I read about 7 newspapers every morning. It's the first thing I do.
I don't know if you remember that old TV show Wife Swap.
No.
Remember Wife Swap?
I want to double tap on your optimism here.
One of the things that gives me hope was always said to my daughters is success is the best revenge.
Correct.
Okay, we're ready. I got a lifetime of knowledge.
Let me call Mimi.
Don't worry, it was so funny. She basically was like, I need an episode on how to own a car because I did all these things wrong and I'm fucked. Yeah, it was so funny.
What to look for. I know we need to do what to look for when buying a house, what to look for when buying a car.
Yes.
But I say that because one of her friends was there and she saw me and she was like, you have the podcast. I listen to it all the time. Like Liza introduced me. She was like, oh, the podcast, which is always
Oh my
fun
God,
to hear.
so funny. I know. That did happen to me recently. Where was I? It was one of the people on the executive committee. We were meant to all listen to an episode on OKRs. And then she went, I heard from Natalie that you have a podcast. And instead I listened to the episode on GLP-1s. I was like, yes.
You're like,
As
yes,
you
world
should.
dominated. Yes, ladies
Exactly.
in the corporate world.
Welcome to Actual Experts. I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Wendy.
And we don't have all of the answers. So we are going to ask the questions.
And today we are asking what the fuck is political polarization to our actual expert, Dame Louise Richardson, the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York and former vice chancellor of Oxford University and University of St. Andrews, both
That's
me
right.
and Caitlin's alma mater.
Yes, which
Mater?
is very
Their
Al-
mater.
yeah. Either
Alma
way.
Mater, which is how we know her. Both Caitlin and I took international relations at St.
Mhm.
Andrews. Caitlin also did a business course. I did not. And I remember Dame Louise Richardson, she was the chancellor, which is effectively like the president of the university.
Head of the school.
Head of the school at the time. And she did our introductory lecture into terrorism. And I was like enamored. I remember that's what I wanted to study was like terrorism and Middle Eastern conflict at the time, 2013. And I remember just thinking she was incredible. I was like,
So
wow.
cool. It was probably the most well-attended lecture out of all of them. Like, so cool. I texted my roommates from university because out of the 6 of us, 4 of us took IR. And everyone was like, oh my God. I think this is probably the most starstruck that I'm going to be out of all of our experts, but only because we have this background with her. And I think as young women in university, she was just such an icon because she also was the first female vice chancellor of St. Andrews, first female vice chancellor of Oxford, and also the first female president of the Carnegie Institute too. So cool.
Truly a trailblazer. I also think, just to shout out her accolades, I think she was also well known while we were at St. Andrews for being the first female member of the Royal Golf Club. Was that?
Yes.
Do you remember?
The RNA, Royal and Ancient. Yeah, she was the one who got them to allow women in because she was the first woman to. So for context for people, St. Andrews University is also in the small town of St. Andrews, Scotland, which is the home of golf where golf was invented. And the first golf club is there. The old course is like this famous course. All these golfer bros or gals will know about the old course. And she was the one who got them to allow women in. I think the first woman to come in was the Queen, was given membership, and then Dame Louise was after that.
Yeah, and it was a big deal. There was a lot of pushback. I remember the club, which is basically a boys' club. It's literally like probably one of the most ancient boys' clubs when it comes to sports in the world. I just looked it up. The first female principal of St. Andrews University says she has been taunted by members of the town's prestigious Royal and Ancient Golf Club after they excluded her because of her sex. This was in 2014 when this came out. Honorary membership to the club is a traditional perk of running the university. That's why she was supposed to be a shoo-in, not least because it lies just 600 yards from the campus. But when Louise Richardson was appointed in 2009, the tradition was abruptly brought to an end. Professor Richardson, at the time, has spoken for the first time of her treatment by the club, which includes its members waving their club ties at her in provocation. Ugh, that just makes me so angry. The Royal Nation Golf Club was once celebrated for being the home of the game, and now even the golf establishment is turning against its anachronistic men-only admissions policy. Wow, I remember when all of this was happening. But
It was
how
so
crazy.
crazy.
And it also says Professor Richardson, who's Irish American, we'll get into that, came to the university from Harvard, where she was executive dean of the university's Institute for Advanced Studies. So just how lucky
She's
are
great.
we? I'm so excited to, yeah.
And okay, when I was doing research, because it's not in the bio that they gave me, but one thing that blew me away too was when she was at Oxford, it was during COVID. And so in 2020, a lot of the vaccine research was coming out of Oxford. So she negotiated with AstraZeneca. So I don't know if you remember, it was the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that they had to develop and sell the vaccine at cost to developing nations so that they could get access to it at the same speed as the developed nations. So she's just like such a cool person. I'm so excited. Okay, I'm going to jump into it because there's actually quite a bit to cover beforehand. The first thing is I did get halfway through her book because we booked her recently. So I tried to read her book, What Terrorists Want, which is become, people say, the go-to book on terrorism. But the opening line I thought is actually so poignant for this conversation on political polarization. It is, while nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him. Which I thought is
Yeah.
very true because trying to understand the other side is quite the feat and a personal feat too when it comes to political polarization.
Totally. I mean, my dissertation at St. Andrews was on how anti-Americanism in the Middle East and Islamophobia in the US following 9/11 were essentially the same thing. It's just like an emotional reaction to the other, basically.
Totally.
So, yeah, amazing. Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why we're having this conversation is because of all the othering and the major polarization of the entire world right now to like the nth degree. I'm so curious to hear her like modern day take on what's happening today. I mean, quite literally today. Today's March 26th. The war in Iran is currently undergoing. That's why we thought it was particularly relevant to the now.
Totally. Totally. Okay. So, facts and figures to give us some context around this. So, 65% of Americans say they always or often feel exhausted when thinking about politics. Don't we all? Especially it feels like right now, we literally can't catch a break. And I think it probably has always felt like this, but I don't know why we just can't seem to catch a break.
I don't think I agree with you, but up until 20 years ago, the internet, 20 years ago, 35 years ago, the internet didn't exist. So you weren't inundated. You got to choose when you ingested current events. You would pick up a newspaper or maybe turn on the TV. But for the most part, it wasn't like glued to your hand. And the whole fake news of it all, which is like you don't actually even know what to believe these days, is not. So like the amount of information that we're getting today versus 20 years ago is like exponentially more, which means
Totally.
we're more exhausted. We don't turn it off.
We can't turn it off. And I think the big difference, Stephen, my husband and I have talked about this a lot, is it used to be when you would go to a newspaper, everything was edited. So there was someone who was saying yes, no, which good or bad, but it was streamlined per se. So it was controlled what you were getting, which removed the double side of it a little bit, which is good that we have access to both sides now, but it just means there's that much more to ingest.
Totally.
Okay, so both political sides think that the other party wants political violence. But researchers found that propensity is over-reported by 300 to 400%. So the threat feels real, but it's mostly a mirror. So you think the other side wants violence, wants agitation, but that's completely over-reported.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me, but it does.
There's no shock.
There's no shock, but also we're all guilty of it. Like even people who
Totally.
think they're self-aware in these situations or in the day-to-day are guilty of it, of like us versus them. It's so interesting. That's crazy.
Okay, and then the last one, before then, I'm just going to give two contextual based on questions that I'm going to ask. So the last one that I have here is this is really interesting. 81% of people say they wouldn't seriously date someone with an opposing political view. And then less than 8% of couples today are one Democrat and one Republican. Polarization is now deciding who we fall in love with.
I mean, totally. I myself, I don't think I could. There's been many times where I've been like, I can't even engage in conversation,
Or sit at
you
the
know?
table. I was thinking about this one. It's kind of, I mean, my Instagram algorithm when it's close to the holidays is so much around like how to protect your emotional health and mental well-being when you have to sit across from like the uncle or the aunt who has a different political side of you. So marrying that would be impossible.
Totally.
Yeah,
I think a lot of it comes down to values. The values that you stand for politically, I think reflect the moral and ethic and lifestyle choices and the things you stand for and believe in. So that at its core would affect who you fall in love with, I would think. But it's just
right.
become so much more intense. I mean, in the US, people say now Republicans now, and Democrats for that matter, the parties don't even reflect what they looked like 20, 30 years ago.
No,
Just
and I think it's important to say also this isn't just in the US. I mean, in the UK, Brexit is the perfect example. We were at university when they voted on leaving the EU, and there was huge tensions on campus. I remember people who were pulling outside and protesting for one side or the other, and it's the same like go to the pub after work in London and someone brings up Brexit, you get two very different responses. It's very polarizing.
South Africa, the ANC versus the DA, the two major political parties, it's not so much like blue and red, but it's what
Right.
they stand for.
Totally.
So yes, worldwide.
Worldwide. Okay, so I just want to give context. There's two topics that happened during Louise's career that I'm going to ask about. One is actually what triggered her interest in studying terrorism. So Louise grew up in rural Ireland, and she also grew up in the heart of the IRA. So for people who don't know, Northern Ireland was at the center of violent conflict known as the Troubles for decades. And it was whether Ireland should merge and become one country or remain part of the United Kingdom. At its heart was a deep divide between Unionists, who were predominantly Protestant and wanted to stay British, and Nationalists, who were predominantly Catholic and wanted a united Ireland. The IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army, was a paramilitary group formerly designated as a terrorist organization by both the British and US governments, using bombings and assassination to push for Irish unification. But where it gets interesting and complicated is that the Loyalist paramilitary group on the other side was also designated as a terrorist organization by the British government itself. So what's really interesting is that Louise grew up within the IRA. And in her book, she spoke about how the people who would drive her to school or her best friend's mom or all these things were labeled as terrorists. And then she went to university, and the Irish history she was taught at Trinity in Dublin was completely different than the history she was taught growing up. And these people who she grew up with were labeled as terrorists. And she was like, how can this, my mom's best friend, be a terrorist? And so that's what triggered her drive into studying terrorism more. So I think very interesting context for us to know.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay. So then the second thing was when she was vice chancellor at Oxford, there was the chancellor at the time named Chris Patten, and he was the British governor of Hong Kong between 1992 and 97 when Hong Kong was being, this is crazy, given back to China. So it was under British rule for 156 years. And in 97, they had to hand it back over to China. During that period of time, when Chris Patten was the British representation, he really pushed democratic values into the Hong Kong population, and China did not like that. And so he was meant to do a trip to China during her time as vice chancellor of Oxford. And China said, if you let Chris Patten come over, we're going to pull all of our Chinese students from the University of Oxford, which is tons of international fees. So a huge issue. And she said, free speech is allowed. This is a form of oppression. And I'm not going to stop Chris Patten from going over. So she called their bluff, let him go. It didn't happen. But China was essentially trying to buy Oxford's silence. So she's very, very pro free speech. I'm going to ask about that because there's this interesting line between where does free speech turn to hate speech?
Yeah. Where do you draw the line? 100%.
So two very interesting context around what she's been doing.
Just like what an incredible, honestly, trailblazer from like the female standpoint, but just like the ability to call the Chinese government's bluff
I know.
when they're like, you know what I mean? Like what? Yeah, truly, like what a force. It's going to be so interesting.
So interesting. Okay. And the other thing I want to say is that the reason, and it's echoing what Lundy said earlier, the reason we're doing this episode is because the news cycle right now is so relentless. And it's hard to know what's true, what's not true, what you're supposed to do with all this. But I think it's important for us to say this is not a political episode. We are not picking sides. It is an episode about the emotional experience of living in a polarized world and what one woman, Dame Louise Richardson, has spent her entire career studying.
Yeah, knowledge is power. And I think we'll probably walk away. I'm interested in the debrief. I think we're going to walk away with a lot more potentially understanding of, the other. Maybe that's
the
the goal.
other. Totally. And I think it'll be very useful to be more optimistic about where we're going.
That's the goal. We could all use a little more optimism these days. So fabulous.
Okay. I'm going to read our bio. So, Dame Louise Richardson is president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Previously, she served as vice chancellor of the University of Oxford and the University of St. Andrews, and as executive dean at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. A native of Ireland, she studied history at Trinity College Dublin before gaining her PhD at Harvard University, where she spent 20 years on the faculty of the Department of Government, teaching courses on international security and foreign policy. Her groundbreaking study, What Terrorists Want, Understanding the Enemy and Containing the Threat, was hailed by the New York Times Book Review as an overdue and essential primer on terrorism and how to tackle it. Richardson has many awards and has been recognized for the excellence of her teaching and scholarship. She has been awarded 11 honorary doctorates. In June 2022, Richardson was appointed Dame Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in recognition of her services to higher education. In 2024, the French government named Richardson a Chevalier in the Order of the Arts and Letters for advancing arts and culture and furthering ties between the US and France.
Incredible. Beyond. No, what is she doing spending a day with us? How lucky are we? Honestly, talk about an actual expert. I can't wait. Let's bring her on.
Bring her on.
Please note that this pod is for educational purposes only. Nothing we say should be taken as financial, legal, or medical advice. Please do your own research, and when in doubt, ask an actual expert. Dame Louise, thank you so much for joining us.
It's so great to meet you. We haven't seen you since we were at St. Andrews in 2016 for Caitlin. 2017 was when we graduated. But
you're kidding.
Yeah.
Have you been back since?
Myself once.
I haven't.
Last year.
No, I've not been back because Lundy and I spent the last Lundy still lives there, but I just moved back to Canada in South Africa working on the ground there.
Oh, really?
Across Africa. So I was in Nigeria for a period, then South Africa, and Lundy was in Ghana and South Africa as well. But we met at St. Andrews and ended up working together for 10 years at different organizations after that.
You're kidding. What have you been doing in Africa? Who are you working with?
We both worked for the same organizations, different ones, then same ones again, but across venture capital, so African tech investing. And then where we started working together was an organization called She Leads Africa, and it was running accelerator programs for women-run businesses across the African continent. And then that kind of transitioned into our last roles together, which was a company called Untapped Global, which was trying to figure out how do you de-risk investing through data. So very interesting. Now we both are doing different things, but we've worked together for 10 years.
You guys. Wow. So you must have studied IR when you were at St. Andrews, did you?
Does it show? Does it show? Yeah, and we both did. And we both took your counterterrorism course and you lectured for both of us. So we can't tell you how much it means that you're back as an actual expert today.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah. So Lundy and I mentioned this, have this interesting shared experience of being in South Africa for the last 10 years. And what was interesting for us is that we were also watching as history was being rewritten post-apartheid. And I was reading your book and I realized that's actually an overlapping experience of you growing up in Ireland and having two sides of history. So I wanted to kick us off in understanding what it was like for you when you got to Trinity and realized history was very different that was being taught there from what you experienced growing up in the heart of the IRA.
Very happy to address that. But if I can just say that I was also in South Africa with the Irish anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, and we were deported. I was actually in Soweto the day the emergency was declared, but that's another story. So that was an abiding interest of mine, because Kader Asmal, who is a name you may be familiar with, he was in the first ANC cabinet. He was a law professor at Trinity and he led the Irish anti-apartheid movement when I was a student. So I was very actively engaged in that. But sorry, that's a tangent. Sorry. On growing up, yes, going to Trinity was an eye-opener. I grew up only 106 miles away, but it could have been a galaxy away. The perspective on the history of this tiny little island was fascinating. Now, it became intriguing to me to realize that my professors had this entirely different interpretation of Irish history. And when I'd go home and say, it didn't actually happen like that, I remember my mother saying, oh, that's just Trinity talk. So there was no sense of shared interpretation on this tiny little island. The country is 150 miles wide, 300 miles long. And so how could two sets of people, well-meaning people, have such diametrically opposed interpretations of the same historical event? That became something really fascinating for me. And it shows just how polarized interpretations are. I found it fascinating. Not so much initially, I think I fought the new interpretation, thinking that's not the way it was. But studying history, you ended up spending a lot of time in primary documents and you realize, actually, I think this is the way it was, which is not the way where I come from we believe it transpired. So I just became fascinated by that.
How do you then rewrite what you believed to be true? It seems something that we are facing today in society so much to be the case, especially with social media, but having to go in and then rewrite what you grew up with and how you understand the people you were surrounded by seems to be something that could be quite difficult.
To me, it speaks to the imperative of trying to understand the perspective of the other. I mean, that's been the through line, if you like, of all my work. My work on terrorism was all about how do you understand what motivates the terrorists. So, I've always seen truth as an aspiration, not a possession. So this talk about my truth, for example, is I really have very little truck with that. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to have different interpretations of what actually happened. And it's not as if I turned around and said, oh, where everyone I came from was wrong. It was more how they've interpreted this is not the only way to interpret it, but how they interpret it is what fuels their opinions and then their actions. So if you want to make progress, I think both sides or all sides have to try and understand the perspective the other is coming from, even if it's one that it's innately unpalatable or intrinsically objectionable.
Right. So are you recognizing then that similar psychology from IRA and Trinity to what's happening today?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm living in the US now, and we're seeing this political polarization within the country, and it's getting much worse than simply Democrats disagree with Republicans or liberals with conservatives. Academics call it, and I know I'm going to trigger Lundy to come in here now because I'm going to use a term called affective polarization. And what this means is you don't just disagree with somebody, but you actively dislike somebody who has different points of view from you. And that's when things become much more bifurcated, much more difficult to forge a common path. If you actually believe the motives of the person you disagree with are unpure, if you like, if you dispute their motives. So yes, I think polarization in and of itself is an inevitable consequence of political systems especially based on two parties. And I mean, were you guys in Scotland during the independence referendum? I mean, there's nothing more polarizing than a binary choice in a referendum. I was in England during the Brexit referendum, the same thing. But if you could assume that the motives of the person who takes the opposite point of view are legitimate, you can carry on. What's been happening increasingly is that people are actively disliking the people with different points of view, and that makes it much, much worse.
We spoke about this earlier and kind of coming back to during the holidays, my social media is always inundated with protect your emotional stability, protect your emotional health. You're about to go sit across the dinner table with your uncle who doesn't have the same opinion as you and is going to trigger you and do all these things. And it is really difficult to see that other side when you feel so emotionally attached to your point of view. And Lundy brought up a really great point, is it feels like it's so values driven when someone has a different point of view and then you don't like them because they have a different value than you.
Well, the way I try to approach it is try to get a sense of what their motives are, what motivates them. And you often find that, I was just recently at a conference of organizations with very different political perspectives than my own. And but in engaging with people, you realize that very often what they're trying to do, they have a real sense that they want to fix the appalling state of education in the US. And that's something I care about too. Even though their analysis of the problem is different and their solution is very different, if we can build on the fact that we both agree that the educational system is failing people, then you can build on that. So rather than trying to win an argument or avoid somebody because they have a different perspective, I'm all in favor of trying to figure out what it is you might have in common and then build from there and not assume that they're evil just because they have a viewpoint that you find really distasteful.
Because that is what it becomes, or what we're seeing more and more today. I feel like in the day today, it's I won't even engage in conversation, or I won't even give you the time of day on the basis that I know you believe X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
We were talking about the difference in relationships. Now I think it's like less than 8% of couples or something like that in the US have opposing political views, which is not entirely unsurprising because we said typically political views are kind of morality driven. But I think would that be your advice as you're sitting at the Thanksgiving table with your uncle who you think has offensive, in your opinion, views, but okay, you got to get down to the basics of what you have in common. You share blood. There's one.
Or,
And
just, you said you were interested in being a diplomat. It's all about diplomacy, really. And shifting the focus and coming at it sideways. So instead of, you know, all these immigrants are terrible, they're coming to take our jobs and be grifters, kind of shifted to somebody who is an immigrant and chatting about them, somebody who has made a huge contribution to society, or saying, in my case, I'm an immigrant. And
yeah,
just trying to, if you back somebody into a corner, you're never going to be able to persuade them of anything. So, yeah, my approach, as I say, is always to come at it sideways. But to be honest, I don't have much time for all this talk about protecting. I think we have to be more resilient emotionally. So you're going to be exposed to people you disagree with, and fine. And I think it's really unfortunate that we've over in recent years gotten into this notion that we have to be protected from hearing things we don't like or uncomfortable situations. As you probably know, got myself in trouble in the past for saying, I don't think education is about being comfortable. I think it's about being uncomfortable. It's about, that's what an education is. It's about engaging with other ideas. So I think this whole movement about protecting one's identity, seeing oneself as a victim is actually really quite harmful. I think we need to be more resilient and not to take ourselves or the world, it's a very serious place. And I don't mean to be flippant or anything, but certainly not take ourselves too seriously.
it's so fair. I grew up in LA, and I listened to another podcast with a woman who's raising her daughter in LA, and they have children at this age, under 15-year-olds who are like getting up in the middle of a, classroom and saying, that's offensive to me, or you're offending me by that, or you're offending me by telling me to stay seated, or what. And this mom was like, we have lost the plot because our children are unable to be uncomfortable or tolerant of anything outside the scope of their idea of like safety and comfort. So it's interesting you say that, because I think, how do we how do we, maintain tolerance within the
Exactly.
younger generation? Like no one can deal with it.
I mean, I think it's a first rule of parenting, really. I mean, our kids threw us an anniversary party recently, and people were asking them what kind of parents we were, and they made this list of things. But one of them is life is not fair. So, our kids would always say, that's not fair. He got more than me or whatever. And I say, no, life isn't fair. Do you know that there are children starving in Africa today, and you're sitting here with more food than you know what to do with, or you're sitting comfortably here when there are people in a leaking boat trying to cross the channel, not knowing whether they're going to get to the other side. And they've got the same feelings and emotions and you have. So yeah, life's not fair. And you're one of the lucky ones. So anybody, the vast majority of people living in LA at the moment are spectacularly privileged
Totally. A
compared
little
to the wider world. Yeah.
little perspective goes a long way.
So they need to hear that, and they don't hear it enough, I think. Sorry, I'm sounding very reactionary, but there you are.
No. Well, I
So
think
relevant.
it speaks to the emotional reality of what we're living into right now. And I'm wondering, is there Lundy and I were chatting about this, so we always do a pre-recording to introduce the topic, and we were chatting about how it can feel very emotionally exhausting too, this conversation. Um, is there a psychological experience of living in a highly polarized society, and does it have an effect on individuals? Because you can see from all three of us it bubbles in a way.
Yes, it does. But I mean, my lesson from this is, we really can't afford, or we can't control how this plays out on the national or global sphere. And I read about 7 newspapers every morning. It's the first thing I do. And this is not a healthy thing to do, but I can't help myself. um, and so you can sit there and be immobilized by, this is just awful what's happening. And it violates everything I believe in. And it's causing unconscionable suffering around the world, and it's all awful. And you can just be immobilized by that, or you can stop and think, okay, I can't control that, but I can control how it affects me. And I can control what I do in my daily life. So if I could just try and do something positive, no, it's not going to fix the broader picture. And I'm trying to avoid getting into commenting on our leader at the moment, but
Hard.
I know. um, I can't control that, but I can control how it affects me, and I think we have to. That's where we can assert our control and assert our independence, and not allow all of that. It simply immobilize us and drive us into depression or apathy. Because
Can I
all
ask
of
a
us.
question about? Oh, sorry. Continue.
Please.
I was going to ask a question around because I find that personally, I go into a state of almost like ignorance is bliss, or bury your head in the sand, because the inundation of negative or bad or depressing news is just too much. And then I feel oftentimes that's a very privileged position to be in, because I am able to just say, I'm not going to read it today, but it doesn't actually in many ways affect my day to day. I don't live in the US right now. And so the war on women's rights, for example, isn't affecting my day to day, but many people I know certainly, or name a group, a marginalized group, they're probably being affected. So where do you draw the line between staying informed and protecting your inner like going back to that like level of tolerance? Like how much do you let in?
I think I just answered that by saying I've completely failed insofar as I do read all these papers.
Totally. As an
Um,
actual expert, it's allowed, I think, for you.
but I can't tell you how many people I know who have said, I've simply stopped following the news. And as you say, that's a privilege some people have, but some people have to follow it because they need to know if ICE is going to be in their community tomorrow. Or,
Totally.
well, we're all reading it now to see if we're going to be able to get through the airports because TSA is not functioning.
Exactly.
And so on. Well, I guess you're picking up from my line is that I tend to be not terribly indulgent of one's, well, I tend to say if you're feeling bad about life, just go spend a couple of hours in a soup kitchen, and then you'll appreciate what you have.
Yeah.
That tends to be my approach, which is one that many people find quite unsympathetic. But anyway.
No, it's good advice. But people these days are saying touch grass. Have you heard that one?
No.
Like you need to go touch grass. Go ground your feet in some grass, aka get away from the
Okay.
screens
Yeah. Yeah.
and go take a deep breath outside. So
Mm.
yeah,
I
that
should
or volunteer.
I should reveal one thing about myself, though. I have zero social media presence. I've never been on Facebook, Twitter, anything else. Celeste, whom you've met, insists I have a Carnegie LinkedIn account, which I reluctantly agreed to when I came here. But that is as far as it goes. I have always simply stayed off social media. And I think that helps maintain. I mean, I read, as I say, I read lots of newspapers, so I know what's happening in the world. But I don't have time. I've never engaged in any form of social media.
That is, Lundy and I speak with that often because in order to get the word out about what we're doing here, we have to have social media accounts to broadcast it. And it is an emotional, taxing journey for us. But before we go any further on this, I do want to just ask one quick question that's more defining. So each of our episodes, we title What the F is, because we're in a moment of what the heck is going on? What is this?
Okay.
So this episode is titled What the F is Political Polarization.
Mhm.
So from your perspective, before we go further in the conversation, how would you define political polarization?
Political polarization is simply when the center starts to collapse and that politics becomes a divide between increasingly extreme points of view with very little connection between them.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful line, if I may, from Yeats back before in the around the time of the War of Independence in Ireland, or just prior to the War of Independence, in which he said, "The centre cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity. The centre cannot hold." And he was talking about a period right on the verge of violence in Ireland. And, you know, that's the nightmare scenario that polarization could devolve into political violence as well. But essentially, it's the collapse of the centre.
Which I feel like we're seeing very real time happening globally right
Absolutely.
now with a concentration in the US, but the ripple effects are everywhere. I read that you said that when you were in the US for 20 plus years at Harvard,
Right.
and you were gone for 14 and you've come back and you said the polarization is horrifying. What are you seeing that maybe people who have been in the US during that period of time might have normalized and don't see anymore that has shocked you the most?
I think it was the different trajectory of polarization in the US and the UK, and that people who lived through COVID, I think the experience of COVID ended up being quite different in both countries. I think both countries were probably as polarized prior to the pandemic. You saw this in the Brexit vote in the UK, and increasingly, well, with the election of Trump won here. And then at the end of the pandemic, the US had just, the polarization had escalated at an extraordinary pace in a way that I felt it hadn't in the UK. And my explanation for this, without evidence, it's just a hunch, is that there were a couple of unifying institutions in the UK, and most especially the BBC. I mean, everybody loves to criticize the BBC and complain about paying the license fee and all the rest of it. But at 6 o'clock every day, we all tuned in throughout the pandemic to hear what was happening. And we believed what we were told, rightly or wrongly. And it was usually a politician plus a science advisor. There was no shared, reliable source of information in the US at all. And instead, the media fractionalized, and you had the whole anti-vax movement and so on. The second unifying institution in the UK was the NHS. I mean, the NHS, if you were in the UK at the time, was really on its knees. But people en masse went out to volunteer to help the NHS help us. People stood at their gates at, I forget what time it was, every Tuesday and clapped the NHS. I mean, again, it brought society together. And again, in the US, there was no unifying institutions. There are no unifying institutions. And that's the best explanation I can come up with as to how why they evolve differently. Now, post-pandemic, I think we are seeing with the growth in reform and the disappointment in the performance of the Labour government that we're seeing, the centre ground being eroded daily in the UK as well. But again, here, especially with this current administration, the polarization has only increased.
And I think to our point of conversation around social media, that is being intensified because of the algorithms that we have and what we're being fed on a daily basis. I'm in Canada. We have CBC. We do have central healthcare. We had a similar experience, I think, that the UK had, and we probably more have a center than the US. And Mark Carney, our current prime minister, sits a little bit more center and was elected on those grounds. So we have a little bit of a different experience than the US is experiencing right now. But when I look at my social media and I look at the news, and the term fake news has been almost weaponized to a degree, how do we then go out into the world and know what to believe?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a problem. And I was saying this to an educator yesterday. What does it mean for young children when none of us believe what the president of the US is saying from one day to another? And what does that mean if you're growing up in an environment where the people who are on a pedestal are not to be believed? It's a real problem. I think we have to have a healthy skepticism without allowing it to erode our self-confidence, if you like. So we have to always be sure of what is the source of the information we're getting and be skeptical about it. I mean, certainly we at Carnegie are investing massively in media literacy, in trying to teach kids or help schools and help libraries that are trying to teach kids how to be skeptical, how to tell a fake from a non-fake. But the pace of technological change is so fast that, I mean, I don't think any of the three of us could tell if there was a fake image of the fourth person next to us. We couldn't tell. So it's not easy, and I don't want to pretend I have answers to all these fiendishly difficult questions.
Yeah, we were discussing that in the intro. We were saying that it seems like polarization maybe is worse now than it was 20, 30 years ago, but maybe we're only growing up within this generation. So what do we know? And I said, I think the exposure on social media and now AI, where we really, fake news actually started prior to AI, where it was really just one side putting out something about the other. But now it's actually, you just don't know where anything sources from and what to believe. And that is scary when there's no singular source of truth, quite honestly.
But going back to your earlier point, I do think this has taken time to evolve, and this is different than it was 20 years ago. I mean, you see the work of Bob Putnam over the past 30, 40 years, looking at the erosion of social capital. Again, his work started in Italy, but then he demonstrated his famous book is called Bowling Alone, and it's basically about why there are no longer any bowling clubs in the US as a metaphor for the collapse of social capital. And that, I think, was driven, it was gradual, and it was driven by two things, I think. That first of all, the introduction of television. So people no longer went out to socialize because they could sit at home and not spend money, just watch television. And the other is the fact that women started working outside of the home. So women, who were the backbone of so much of the social capital in communities, no longer had time for it because they were both working outside the home plus having a family. And so they simply didn't have time. So it's been a gradual process of the erosion of the senses of community. And then now you have this introduction of this completely malign, well, it can be used for positive forces, but has had very malign impacts on, as we've seen in the two court cases that were resolved yesterday, finding very much against the social media giants about how they have deliberately used the algorithms to foment addiction amongst young people to deleterious effects.
It's so scary. I think what's interesting in this is there's a through line to this entire conversation, which is also free speech and being able to voice yourself and voice both sides and hear it. And when reading this, I read about your experience with Chris Patton and the Chinese government and Hong Kong. And then I found this quote of yours of all legal speech should be permitted at a university. When push comes to shove, I would defend any legal speech here, however objectionable I find it. But we are now seeing what was previously labeled hate speech now being relabeled as free speech. And so my question to that is where does free speech end and then speech that might actively recruit people into extremism begin? And who gets to draw that line? Because that's what the struggle internally is right now.
Well, the position I've taken on this is that the one you've just quoted, which is it's up to our political leaders to decide what's legal and what's not. And once it's legal, it should be heard on a university on condition that there is somebody there to counter it. So I actually defended Islamic extremists, provided they weren't prohibited, legally prohibited from coming and speaking on campus, provided there was the opportunity for somebody to be next to them to counter their point of view. And that would be my position. So I would defend name an objectionable person as right to speak, provided I or somebody with views counter to them is able to, at the same place, in the same setting, express counterpoints of view.
So to put that into reality, that would be someone from the KKK versus the person who shot Charlie Kirk. Those are the extremists.
Well, the KKK, I think, is prohibited. It's not a legal organization. So incitement to violence is criminal. So, I think it's up to the legislators to decide what is criminal and what isn't. And if they have said it's not criminal, we should entertain it, no matter how difficult, objectionable we find it.
So all the conversations we're seeing now that in previous administrations would have been legally potentially labeled as hate speech. And now it's being told by current administration, oh, no, this isn't hate speech. This is free speech. When we're kind of seesawed in that way, how do we know how to take a stance in that?
Well, in a sense, I don't know if you remember the case, and I'll leave the names out of it, but this happened when I was at St. Andrews, when there was an appointment of a professor who, and the Students' Association came to me and said, you've got to overrule this appointment. He's got homophobic views. And now he wasn't appointed for anything related where his views on homophobia would emerge. And they said, if he expressed those, nobody would be comfortable taking his classes knowing that he held those views. And I said, no, I'm not prepared to overrule his appointment. But if he ever expresses a homophobic view, I will be the first person in line to counter those views. But we can't prevent him. He's not being he was a very distinguished person in an unrelated field. And I don't actually know whether he was homophobic or not, but that was beside the point. Students believed he was. And I felt it, we've got to, even though I think homophobia is absolutely abhorrent and would rush to counter anybody who expressed homophobic views, I didn't think that the fact that a man was alleged to have these views should prevent his appointment as a professor.
And the proliferation of that more so recently was cancel culture, which it almost came and then it's almost gone. We are seesawing so often, but cancel culture was rife, where if you had anything that anyone deemed as offensive or wrong, be that what it may, you were canceled, you were out potentially a job, your entire career could be ruined. Some celebrities will never work again for reasons that I may believe are correct. But it's, again, where do you draw that line where someone's entire livelihood, career, family could be uprooted because someone somewhere said you're wrong? And it's a dangerous, in many ways, I think a dangerous thing.
I absolutely agree. And I think what we're seeing now is a backlash against that. And I think universities lost their way. They should never have tolerated a cancel culture. And they did. And now we're seeing the backlash.
That is so interesting because when I look back at my time at St. Andrews, one of the pivotal moments that sticks out to me is I was in IR in a tutorial and we were talking about the Cold War, and there was a Russian student sitting with us and he had a completely different history of the Cold War that was taught to him. He was taught that Russia won the Cold War and he did this whole amazing presentation on it. And my mind was blown, and it wasn't as polarizing as you should be allowed an abortion or you shouldn't be allowed an abortion, where people are emotionally invested in. I was not emotionally invested in the Cold War, but having someone across the table have a completely different opinion than me and teach me a completely different perspective was such a pivotal moment for me in understanding the importance of diversity at the table. And now we're seeing universities being completely politicized, and what they're allowed to teach is being controlled. There's with Harvard, there's the issues with the Trump administration. So I the question is, like, what is the danger of this, of seeing universities lose their neutrality?
Oh, well, as I say, I'm very critical of the fact that universities really did not live up to their value system, to their responsibilities to ensure freedom of speech and not allow a culture to take hold. But now we're seeing a deliberate effort to control history, to control what's taught at universities. And this is one of the first things, autocrats do. We've seen, Russia has been systematically attacking libraries and educational institutions in Ukraine as a way of trying to wipe out Ukrainian history, or wipe out a version that's antithetical to the one they're promoting. Um, and I think we absolutely have to resist this. And universities today have to stand up and not allow the government to decide what history should be taught. Well, one of the things that, as you can tell, I'm quite an optimist, and one of the things that gives me hope was a study by a group called More Perfect, and they interviewed liberals and conservatives in the US about history, and it's about the history wars, what history should be taught. And the extraordinary thing about it was there was about 7% on each extreme, which had very, very strong views, but the overwhelming majority actually agreed on what should be taught in history, that slavery should be taught, for example, that the treatment of the Native Americans, or there was enormous consensus amongst about 70% of the population as to what history should be taught. But what was more interesting was there was a complete misunderstanding amongst liberals about what they thought conservatives thought was legitimate history to be taught, and a comparable misunderstanding amongst conservatives about what they thought liberals felt should be taught. So I'm convinced that there is, in fact, a strong majority which believe in democratic values, who believe in an accurate portrayal of, say, American history. But they are not being heard at the moment. And what's being heard are the extremes, and the nature of the two-party political system, with a winner-take-all system and a primary system that plays to the extremes, is that it's the extremes who are having the loudest voice. So it seems to me that the onus is on those of us who don't belong to the extremes to try to ensure that we have a louder voice. But it's hard, given just the structure of democratic politics in this country. And perhaps that's why politics in Canada have they're a beacon of hope for the rest of it, because they have been so much more reasoned and reasonable than elsewhere.
But it was a close call. We had very extreme political parties before Mark Carney stepped up, and that extremism was igniting, which I'm sure is a similar percentage, that 7% in Canada. And it was scary to see what we held so close to be more of a neutral country and a neutral society, to see that extremism have such a sway in society. I want to double tap on your optimism here, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation. I know at the Carnegie Institute, you've have over 121 million in grants trying to figure out how do we work on polarization. What are you finding out of that research? What is making you optimistic? Because what's important for this conversation is to take actionable steps away. We want people to listen and say, okay, this is what I can do with my voice, or how I can feel in those moments of absolute rage when I am sitting at the table and my body is being politicized and I'm told I can do this or I can't do that. So out of this research, what are you seeing? What should we be optimistic about?
In truth, the nature of research is that it takes a long time to get clear evidence.
Yeah.
So we're taking a short, medium, and long-term approach to this. On the longer term, we're funding academic research on political polarization. And so for the last 3 years, we've written to all universities and said, nominate 2 people working on political polarization. And we end up selecting 30 of them. We give them a couple of $100,000 to go off and try and help us understand political polarization, and B, make recommendations as to what we can do to mitigate it. So this is the 3rd year in which we've done this, and we've had about between 350 and 400 nominations each year. So by the end of this round, we will basically have seen the research of everybody in the US who is working academically on political polarization. So, and then funding all the ones we think have the best insight. But that's going to take some time to play out. And the medium term, we're doing things like making a push for national service. We believe that, I don't mean military service, although if people want to do military service, fine, that there are far too few opportunities for meaningful interaction across race, region, and class. And we believe that if people were to spend a year with people unlike themselves, working on a shared project, whether it's building a house, running a soup kitchen, running a library, what have you, something that contributes to the community, that they're working with others unlike themselves on, they would break down their prejudice about people unlike themselves, and they would gain, we believe, a keener appreciation of democracy and of their communities. So we're funding a couple of states. We're funding Maryland, which is a Democratic state led by a Democratic governor, and Utah, a Republican state with a Republican governor. And we're funding national service initiatives in both states. And we're hoping, we've kind of, if you like, written off the federal level for progress and believe that states is where it's at if you want to do something, get something accomplished. And the goal is to get other states to see these initiatives and adopt them in their own states. We're in discussion with a number of other states at the moment.
A quick question around
sure.
the detail of the inner workings of that. How do you identify and get volunteers who are stuck in their ways to go see the other side? I'm like picturing, I don't know if you remember that old TV show Wife Swap.
No.
Remember Wife Swap? They would take wives or mothers from 2 vastly different families, from
Mhm.
the middle of nowhere and a big city, or what, big family, small family, and they would swap only the wives. Of course, it was the mothers, like the center of the household. And then you would basically watch chaos ensue for a week, that they would come in and try to apply their rules and their,
Yeah.
to the family. But there was a little bit more appreciation when they returned home for their own families, or what they had, or what they learned from the other side. So that's what I feel a reality TV show would benefit from this experiment. But how do you find those people?
That's a great concept. So I don't think you recruit people on the basis that it will teach them to be or empathetic to others. I think you recruit them on the basis of, well, the Maryland one is really quite explicit about this will get you work skills in the age of AI. This will get you experience. Employers want people with experience, but when you come out straight out of university, you basically don't have it. So here's a chance to get some real world experience. So you don't, the ulterior motive, if you like, is to inculcate a sense of empathy, but that's not a recruitment tool.
Fair enough.
And actually, these 2 programs are somewhat different in how they operate. Anyway, so that's the middle range, and then the near-term thing, we're funding rafts of groups called Disagree Better. Where an organization called Narrative 4, which I love, which was founded by an Irish novelist, Colin McCann, which believes in the power of narrative, and he gets kids from very different backgrounds. He recruits them through schools and matches up schools, one in Appalachia and one on the Upper East Side of New York, say, and the kids get to learn the stories of the other and narrate those stories. Now, who knows what the long-term consequence of this will be? The short-term consequence is it changes their minds about these kids. Another one called Academic Exchange, where again, it sounds a little bit like wife swapping. You except you swap the kids from, say, Appalachia and the Upper East Side just for a week. So we're funding a raft of these initiatives. But I can't honestly say we can demonstrate real progress at this stage. I've been in my post 3 years, and it took, as I said earlier, a long time for this society to get into this polarized state. I think it's going to take a long time to get out of it. But if you want another example of, to give you optimism, if you take the broad historical sweep, I mean, the Gilded Age was a period of extraordinary inequality, and I do think the extraordinary economic inequality in this country is part of what's driven this polarization. But that was true also in the Gilded Age. But that led to the progressive era of enormous, or it was followed by an era of enormous social welfare benefits and gains in society that led to removing many of those inequalities. So it is possible to get out of this, I believe, but it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a very different political leadership to help us to.
Yes. Well, they say the pendulum always swings. That is one thing that, I mean, in studies and looking throughout history, the pendulum always swings. Are you a believer in that? I think that's probably evidenced, right, throughout history.
I think it is. I think it is, but we can't be complacent either. And the problem is so many people suffer when the pendulum. It's easy to sit back and say, well, it'll be all right in the end, but we're not being deported to Guinea-Bissau or someplace, or Equatorial Guinea, as I was hearing about somebody yesterday. People are, not to mention the terrible suffering of people in Ukraine and the Middle East today.
Right.
I hear you on all this, and I want to be actionable.
You might be convinced, but you're not. Okay.
No, I am convinced, as I am a data point in your study. So I grew up in a very privileged household, but I had the opportunity to go abroad and live for an extended period of time in a rural area of Nepal by myself as my gap year, which was, I can't believe my parents let me do this, but they did. And they let me live by myself for 3+ months in a rural, unconnected village, and living outside of my day-to-day completely transformed my perspective. It's why I ended up at St. Andrews. It's why I ended up going and working in Africa for a decade. So that swap that you're talking about, I am one data point, but it worked for me. But when I'm thinking about this in a day-to-day, and I'm thinking about polarization, I sit and watch a bunch of white men in their 50s sit around a table on a podcast and say, hey, women should not be allowed to make choices about their own bodies. They shouldn't go to work. They should make babies and stay at home. I understand wanting to see the other side, and I can say, okay, I can understand where you come from, but then what next? What is the next step after that of trying to make sure we are not containing these polarizations on either side?
But what was said to my daughters is success is the best revenge.
I love that. I love that. That's why we're here.
And I think the part we can control again is how the extent to which we let it, or what our attitude is when we encounter this naked misogyny, whatever, sexism. And to me, I always found it amused me, and I didn't let it get me down. I mean, I have so many hundreds of stories, but as Vice Chancellor of St. Andrews, I'm thinking of one situation where I was introduced to somebody as the Vice Chancellor of St. Andrews, of Oxford. And 5 minutes later, he turned to me. We were waiting for a minister to arrive. And he turned to me and he said, the Vice Chancellor is supposed to be here. Well, he's not here yet. Do you know when he's coming? And I mean, that kind of thing happened a lot. So the cognitive dissonance was just so great. Even though he was introduced to me, he just assumed I had to be the assistant to the Vice Chancellor. Now, I love that, and it made me laugh for the rest of the day. But I never let that kind of upset me. Or people would say, again, happened all the time, kind of in a very condescending way, oh, did you travel with the Vice Chancellor if we were overseas? And I am the Vice Chancellor. And again, people would get angry on my behalf if they witnessed things like this. Colleagues witness this all the time and would get very angry. I said, not at all. This made my day. But he'll never make that mistake again.
Yeah.
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 So
then
that we can control.
my takeaway from that is have a sense of humor and stay the course.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a good, because I'm sitting here, I'm like, we're all guilty of feeling that level of like rage, quite honestly, when something strikes the nerves, whatever topic it is that means a lot to you, whatever that may look like. And I think that was going to be one of my last questions is what would your advice be to people who have cut ties with family members or loved ones who just can't fathom having a relationship with someone who thinks so differently from them?
I'd go back to what I said earlier and try and figure out some common ground. So if it's a relation, if it's an uncle, surely that uncle has a child that they care about and that you like, or there must be something, or even if they, I don't know, like fishing, but ideally find something that you share and try and build on that.
Yeah.
Because, being angry is just corrosive. This may sound like a real tangent, but going back to where we began in South Africa, there's a wonderful piece in Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, which I've never forgotten, in which he said when he came out of prison, he had to think about what his attitude was going to be to the people who'd locked him up for 27 years. And he said, I knew I only had a few years left. And was I going to spend those years being angry and looking for vengeance, or was I going to enjoy those years? And as we know, he was extraordinarily magnanimous. And that enabled him to enjoy those years and had enormous impact and was, an inspiration across the globe. But in a sense, that's what I'm suggesting. Don't get consumed by anger because it hurts yourself. Whatever about the misogynistic uncle or the racist aunt or whatever. I would try and figure out something and build on that.
It's such good advice because that anger is what is harnessed, and
Yeah,
that's what
exactly.
they, not to other, but whoever it is harnessing and is weaponizing effectively is that like,
Yeah.
Inner rage. So,
And they're doing it deliberately to make money, which is what the social media companies are doing. And just refuse to allow yourself to be manipulated in that
have a
way.
sense of humor and stay the course.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
perfect
My
takeaways.
good takeaway. I'm going to end us off on one last question that we ask each of our guests, and it is always, what should every woman know about the topic we're speaking about? So in this case, what do you feel like every woman should know, take away from this on political polarization?
It's not as bad as it seems if you don't let yourself be captured by it. Is that okay?
I will certainly take that away. That's such a great, just in like how you walk around in the world and how you interact with others. Like it's a choice to a degree, how much, again, it goes back to the privilege conversation. A lot of these things, there is no choice in how much it impacts you, but how you react to it is the only thing in your control, to go back to your earlier point.
I'm going to end us on that very happy note. Dame Louise Richardson, thank you so much for joining us on Actual Experts. You were our number one guest to get for the podcast, so we feel so lucky, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Lonnie. It's been an absolute pleasure. Best of luck with the podcast and everything else.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the debrief, where we discuss things we needed a little more clarity on.
Okay, Dame Louise,
political polarization. We recorded this a few weeks ago, and I kind of forgot how epic she is.
No, I know I mean, yeah, to the surprise of no one, she's really just an incredible woman, and the way she speaks, she like gave me such hope.
Yes,
honestly.
It's also, Stephen does like, he always describes, there's like certain women that he meets that are older, and he's like, they're like the moms that are super strong, that like make you feel confident in your ability to do something, but also that there's like people there to help you along the way. Totally. And she is one of those people that's like, I can do this, I'm confident I can do it, but there's also very intelligent, experienced people that are guiding us on our way. Yeah, she is one of those people.
Exactly. I know, and for her to take the time, to sit down with us was amazing. So, I have a couple takeaways.
Me too. You can
Probably,
start if you want.
I'm sure they're similar. The first one, I thought from a practical standpoint, I liked her feedback when it came to sitting across from someone who you do not agree with, be it a family member or a loved one or a stranger, and how to approach that, because we've all been there and we've all, I mean, I've certainly like not been my best self in those situations where I just can't find
Totally.
myself to meet in the middle. And so
Yeah.
I like that she said that by find any similarity, find like any common
Common
ground.
ground.
What
Yeah.
does that person care about that you also care about? There has to be something. Find that and then kind of work from that way. And she had said, like, with diplomacy, you go through the side door. Like, you're clearly not going to connect on the first floor thing. So like find something else. So I feel like I'll hear her in my ear, and the next time
Yeah.
inevitably one of those conversations comes up, and just be
I
like,
know.
let's
I
both,
know.
yeah, find the humanity in the middle, I think was a good one.
Find the humanity in the middle, but it's easier said than done
Yeah.
because I see red.
Yeah.
So it's like this trigger button goes off in me when someone, usually it's around like someone not being empathetic to someone else's situation, and a trigger goes off for me, and I am polarized. I am on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
I am the definition of polarization.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, finding common ground, but for me, her whole have a sense of humor and stay the course,
Yes.
I think that will be the most useful for me, because I think if I have a little bit of sense of humor in like, this is so crazy, we have such different opinions.
Yeah.
And then that is my first step, and then I find the common ground. I think I need that like, haha, oh my God.
Totally.
moment.
Totally. And I think she also said you can only, I mean, and this is echoed in all areas of life, but you can only control how you react. Like there's so much we
Yeah.
talked about, like how existential it feels and how like uncontrollable all of this feels, because most of it is out of our control. And the one thing you can control is your reaction and how much you let it affect you, which again, easier said than done. Sometimes it
Yeah.
just comes
Takes
over
you
you.
over.
Yeah, takes it
Yeah.
over, exactly. But it's a good kind of reminder of like you can only control yourself and how you react. And so if
Totally.
you don't become the angry aggressor, then you only would hope that the person across from you would also not become an angry aggressor, and then world
Yes.
peace.
World peace. We've solved it all.
Peace.
We've solved it all. Okay, that is actually good. My other one, this leads into it, is it is important to be uncomfortable. And I think we as society, and our generation is very guilty of this, is that we are like, do you know what? This makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to leave this situation.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is, if we want to find common ground as society, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, hearing other people's opinion, because if we just walk and remove ourselves, we're never going to find that middle ground. So it's a good reminder. It's one of those things I was thinking about after, where this wasn't an episode where we're like, haha, feel good, walk away, like, do. This is an episode where the reality is we have to do the work.
Yeah.
And the work includes hard work of being uncomfortable to find middle ground, to find a way forward. Otherwise, we're just going to it's going to be circular in the position we're in now.
Totally. And then we are as bad as whoever we encounter if we're,
Totally.
no tolerance for whatever it is, you know what I mean? So it's true.
Yeah.
And I think my other kind of within the control, the theme of control, is how much you ingest is also within your control. And
Yes.
we touched on it a little bit. I mean, a level of that is privilege, and how whether or not these things in your day-to-day life impact you. Plenty of it. She said it herself. If you're wondering if ICE is going to come knock on your door, you don't really
Totally.
get the option of turning the other
Yeah.
cheek. But she's never been on social media. How crazy is that?
What a
For
dream.
a world renowned
Leader.
and policy policy
Advisor.
expert, for her to never have had presence, or to need or to want presence on social media, goes to show you can get your your news elsewhere and limit the amount that
So this is a message to all of our listeners. We'll be removing ourselves from social media. Please like and subscribe so that you get the real notifications. Send this to all your friends so that Lundy and I can remove ourselves from social media.
Wouldn't that be
Thank
nice?
you so much.
And we would, yes, the New York Times and The Economist to be our next sponsors. Thank you so much.
Exactly.
And we, for the sake of no polarization, Fox News and CNN, both of them. We'll take them both. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Just bring it all. Bring it all.
Exactly.
That is, I guess that was my last one. My last one was the success is the best form of revenge when things aren't going your way. And the reality is, you are having the conversation that it's hard work. We need to have a seat at the table in order to help make these decisions. If we're upset about it, about what's happening in the world, or we feel like the side we maybe don't align with is making all the decisions on behalf of us, unfortunately, we're just going to have to work harder, get a seat at the table, and be a part of those decision making, because success is the best form of revenge. Should we use the word revenge? Who's to say? But I am saying it. I am claiming it. Louise Richardson said it, so I am claiming it as well.
And she tells her daughter. So if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. But what an honor, truly, for us to have had her. She was one of our first, I mean, all of our actual experts have been amazing, but she's truly a global leader and like renowned expert. It's an exciting signal, I think, hopefully for us too. So thanks, Dame Louise.
For what's to come. Thanks, Dame Louise. This is cool. Go girls.
Woo! All right. See you in 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Woohoo! Bye.